Welcome to Applied Innovation.
Hi, and welcome to Go Live from Capgemini Applied Innovation Exchange, San Francisco. I'm Andreas and your host today. The future of work is such a multifaceted theme. Regardless of how it all started, this is our chance to redesign work. Today's Go Live is about how we can make it better. A recent study from Oxford Economics showed that 64% of employees are already working from home most of the time. And as an employer, Twitter recently announced that working from home will forever be an option for its employees. And to be honest, for most of us, I think the shift to working from home has gone surprisingly well. However, other studies suggest that many are struggling to adjust and that maintaining employee morale is a challenge. Loneliness seems to be a pain point as companies design more permanent remote work practices. We need to continue to stay close and stay in touch. Our focus needs to include establishing new collaborative practices and implementing the right technology that brings people together. We need to avoid sudden drop-off in social interactions because that would impact not only productivity, but also health. Regardless of how all of this started, it's, as I started to say, this is an opportunity to redesign work and making it better. And there's no better way to explore that theme than with our guests today. And I am proud to introduce two amazing thought and business leaders, Rajiv Ayyangar, co-founder and CEO of Tandem, and Chris Farinacci, COO of Asana. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks.
So just a quick intro, Rajiv. You're the CEO and co-founder of Tandem. It's a virtual office for remote teams, and the history behind Tandem when you and the co-founders started working remotely and to have your first children, and feeling this massive gap in existing collaboration tool and how that started Tandem. That's going to be interesting to hear more about. Welcome, Rajiv.
Thank you, Andreas.
And Chris is, as I said, Asana CEO, leading the company's business growth and go-to-market efforts. And before joining Asana, Chris led global marketing for Google's enterprise and education business. Chris holds a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering from The Ohio State University. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks for having me. I like your kitchen.
Thank you. Yeah, it's the new normal. We invite each other to our home. So welcome to my home here in Palo Alto. Good to have you as guests.
Thanks.
Yeah. So Rajiv and Chris, again, great to have you. I really look forward to this conversation around the future of work and what goes around now, the new normal, and we're shaping it. We see the contours of what's going to happen and what the new normal looks like. But also on the other hand, we're just beginning to see it. We're just beginning to see it, and we have an opportunity to shape something which could even be better than we had before. What is your take generally on what's going on today, Chris and Rajiv?
Go ahead, Rajiv.
I think that what we're seeing, we make a tool that helps teams talk with each other every day. And what we're seeing in terms of the communication patterns is actually very closely related to what we were seeing before. It's just accelerated the transformation. So I think that even before COVID, every company at some scale, as you mentioned, I think you mentioned the stat, like 64% of people were remote to some degree. Every company at some scale is distributed or remote. You have salespeople traveling in the field. You have multiple offices. multiple campuses, people working from home. There are teams that are hybrid. So to some degree, every team was distributed and felt that. And now what we're seeing is we've just been pushed faster, I think. And so I don't see a discontinuity in how people are approaching things. I do see a new attention given to the cultural aspects of going remote and sort of the more complex things about the interpersonal dynamics of being remote.
I understand. Yeah. Chris?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that's a great answer. I've been doing these sort of future of work panels and discussions for 15, 20 years, and I'm not a big fan of like the Minority Report 20 years out stuff. I'm really interested in like what's happening now, and it's very much like what you've said. In my mind, what's happening is transformation and the push for sort of modern tools to enable teams to work remotely and distributed is just getting accelerated, and the need. We're a company that sells software that basically provides team and organizational clarity of who's doing what when. And, that was a giant pain in the world before this, and it's driven a lot of adoption in the category recently. And we've just seen it accelerate because it's so hard to stay aligned when you're all in the same building, in the same room. It's even harder when you're globally distributed, whether that's remote or just global teams. And so I think the answer to all of this is it's definitely going to accelerate the focus on the future of work.
I understand. I mean, one key aspect that I'm going to be listening to and asking you and seeing what your perspective is, the connection between the necessity as human beings to meet, to collaborate, to stay close to one another, to have this social interaction. And the core of that is obviously from a business perspective that when you bring a team together to solve a problem, you actually get greater results than if each of them try to figure it out themselves. So how can software and new platforms help address this remote working from home while at the same time having to pull individuals together and then create teams and get to that social interaction aspect? That's kind of what I'm really interested in hearing. Just generally, what do you two see happening there? I mean, both past, present, and future.
Want to go, Rajiv?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think one way to slice these questions is to think about the communication apps, like how we talk to people, and the collaboration apps, how we do work with each other. And I think one of the interesting things we've seen, because we sort of span the two. So Tandem, you can see who's around, who's on your team, and you can talk in one click. And then in one more click, you can join your teammates on a Google Doc or on an Asana board. And since we bridge communication collaboration, we see a lot of the teams coming through what tools they're using. And there's been a huge acceleration in how teams adopt cloud tools for collaboration, multiplayer tools like Asana in every area, whether it's design with people moving to Figma, which is collaborative and multiplayer in the cloud, documents. People have been on Google Documents forever, but we're seeing a huge surge in adoption from newer versions like Notion. Project management, we're seeing a lot of teams who weren't using anything before and are now using modern tools like Asana. So I think that we're seeing an acceleration on both fronts, communication and collaboration.
I would add maybe, or just an incremental spin to that, which is like, I mean, your premise, I 100% couldn't believe more, right? Which is like all great work in the world starts with teams, whether that's org-wide, team-wide, profit, non-profit, whatever. I don't think the future is necessarily remote work, like people working by themselves. I think the future is, work from wherever you are, and with the context of your role and everyone on the team knowing what their role is. And there are certain aspects that are better, live, certain aspects that can be async, certain aspects where you need to be in the same room, certain things you can do just fine without that. And we can drill into that over the conversation. And I think just that more intentionality and just clarity, and alignment around what the whole team's goals are and how that work breaks down, and real-time visibility of that is the way of the future.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I really agree with that.
Yeah. Okay. So, Rajiv, I think I'll hand over to you the presentation abilities here in the platform, and I know you've prepared some slides for us and walk us through from a Tandem perspective what this looks like or what it can look like. So we're seeing sharing the content here, and now we see your slide.
Great. Yeah, I'll just do a very brief introduction of Tandem, what problem we're solving. I'll talk a little bit about our backstory, and feel free, Andreas, Chris, to highlight anything you find interesting or want to dig into more.
Yeah, sure.
Tandem is a virtual office for remote teams, and the problem, our starting point as a founding team was really facing this problem of loneliness and lack of communication in remote teams. And we saw this not just through talking with lots of teams, through leading remote teams ourselves, but we saw this, as a trend in the world. So one of the best cross-sectional examinations of remote work is the Buffer's State of Remote Work. They do it every year. They've done it for the past several years. And when asked what's the biggest struggle with working remotely, the plurality of people mentioned at the top, collaboration and communication and loneliness. And we experienced this firsthand. So our background, we're the team behind Astrid and Aviate, which were both productivity apps that were acquired by Yahoo, where we worked together. And afterwards, we were working on another company, which was a remote team. And we became remote partly, as you mentioned, Andreas, because both of my co-founders had kids. And to have that balance, we started working from home some part of the week. And when we did that, we felt this firsthand. We'd managed teams before, but that were remote, but feeling it as a founding team, we really felt the slowdown in our speed and our velocity. We also felt the disconnection. It was harder to coordinate what we were working on. We felt the loss of creativity. When we had ideas, it was more difficult to really explore those ideas fully. And also we just felt like we weren't as much of a team anymore. And so we have a background building productivity apps. We decided to see if we could solve this problem. And that's kind of how we came to Tandem. So what Tandem does is it recovers that virtual water cooler. It lets you talk more organically. It lets you, you can also have meetings in it, but it lets you recover some of the spontaneous communication that's missing when you go to remote work. And the way it works is you can see who's around and you get a sense of who's free based on social cues, like whether people are in this concept of rooms, which is like a call that's visible to the team. You also get a sense of who's around based on availability. So you can sort of see which of your teammates is online or offline. And then you can talk in one click, just like a tap on the shoulder. And one of the things we realized early on is, when you're in an office, especially around your core team, your innermost team, the people you sit next to, you get a sense of who's available to talk based on whether they have headphones, they're listening to music, or whether they're in the room or not in the room. And so to replicate some of that, we've allowed you to share, it's always in the user's control, but we've allowed you to share which work app you're using. So I know who's available to talk based on whether people are coding or in Slack or in Google Docs or in Zoom. So I can tell they're in a meeting, and I think the analogy here is it's very similar to this voice chat app called Discord, which is what gamers use to talk with their friends while they're playing games. Except for us, the games are the multiplayer apps like Google Docs, like Figma, like Asana. And so this is a really key part of how teams are staying connected. And the other thing is we've designed this tool for internal communication and collaboration. So the main mode that people use Tandem is talking on some sort of document or tool, sharing their work. We have lightning fast screen share that shows other people's cursors that can point out things on your screen. And we have the ability to, if I see that you're in a Google Doc, you can share the Google Doc with me in one click, or I can join you in the Google Doc in one click. So the full flow that we're recovering is you see who's around, you talk on one click, you get on the same page. And that flow we've seen just resonate with tons of teams, from tiny startups to large companies. And so actually all of these companies had teams using Tandem before coronavirus. And so I think the thing that we really see is that, as I mentioned before, what's happening now is an acceleration of what was happening before. It's not necessarily a totally new thing. We were seeing teams adopt Tandem before, even teams that were not classically like remote teams. I think we're going to continue to see that in the future.
Right. I think that's an interesting question. Maybe what comes first? Thinking of the quote of, from the idea from Clay Shirky from many years ago, him saying that the revolution doesn't come from technology or new apps or new solutions, but it comes from new behavior. That's where we see, change of, various things. Behavior comes first, and then the adoption of technology. Now, with this new context situation, our behavior has been kind of maybe forced upon us because of the context and the COVID-19 thing. But behavior changed, and then obviously because of that change of behavior, we can more easily adopt new tools, platforms, or we have to. Regardless of that, that behavior has changed. What, in your experience, your view, are some potential challenges in implementing these things? I mean, even if we take away the COVID-19 context, I've seen many times introduction of collaboration platforms and tools are difficult for them to take off in use because they are not really in sync with how we usually behave in sharing or collaborating. They may be forcing upon us, new routines and processes, maybe. So what's your view on how to overcome challenges like that, and how do you actually get to new behavior and enabled by tools?
Yeah, I have some thoughts on that, and then I'd also love to get Chris's thoughts on that, from the different perspective of the collaboration apps. I think that one of the things we see, there is a bridge that needs to happen. So what we see a lot is when teams transition to being remote, the ones that are successful don't try and translate exactly what they did in the office to being remote. What they try to do is understand the purpose of those activities and translate the purpose. So I think one example is you think about lunches in the office. It's a social space for people to gather together and talk, right? And when you try to translate that exactly, it turns out it's very difficult to coordinate lunch with your team when you're remote. And it can be a lot more awkward to eat in front of the computer. But if you think about the purpose, if you drill one step deeper and think about the purpose of lunch, right, and try and replicate that space, what we see is teams doing lots of things around trying games, like lightweight games where they can talk over it, or sharing photos on some app like Figma. We see a lot of team activities where they share photos of their family and talk about them on something that's collaborative. And so instead of lunch, you get a different thing that's much better digitally, something multiplayer, and you get that same space and that same purpose. So we, I think that translation needs to happen.
Yeah, it sounds like fluidity is a key word, that it's frictionless, and the fluidity is really important in terms of how software supports that human interaction or that human behavior, so to speak. That's how I'm interpreting it. Chris?
Yeah, is a lot of the question too is like, how is adoption happening with these tools in the future of work, right? So my view is, and I've sort of been through these phases, we're kind of in this new phase of the way companies adopt enterprise tech, and I'll use like collaboration and productivity as an example. Every company almost every company has sort of a Google or Microsoft shop, right? For some core productivity stuff like email, calendar, and contacts, and maybe documents. And then in collaboration and productivity, they tend to pull in and eventually standardize on tools that sort of complement that, where maybe Google or Microsoft don't have offerings or are immature offerings, right? And so if you look at the history of just the way companies adopt and buy enterprise software, business software, like, forever the phase for 20 years was just top-down selling to executives and decision makers and IT that was sort of inflicted on users, right? And then there was this, which a lot of good came out of, but also like the end user experience wasn't all that great, which gave way to sort of this next phase, which is sort of like consumerization, right? And companies building great tech for you to use at home, and then figuring out how to enable companies to bring it to work and monetize it. And a lot of good came out of that, but there was also some challenges there in that, like, shadow IT and those things not necessarily being ready for real enterprise scale and all that kind of stuff. And then, so in my mind, there was this sort of third generation this decade, and I would put Asana, but I'd put like our partners in other categories like Zoom and Slack and Dropbox and companies like that in the same buckets. Where very intentionally the model is hybrid, right? So we're, the software is being brought in team by team, bottoms up, but we're building product primarily for work, not for home. It's being used at home, but the primary focus of the company is great technology that's adopted bottoms up, and it's sort of post shadow IT. IT knows this is happening, and then we're very intentionally all building go-to-market teams that work with IT to help. Basically what happens is word of mouth and sort of organic adoption drives proof of concepts inside companies, and then those companies can adopt. Sometimes it's multiple tools, sometimes it's single tools that are proven out as most valuable for teams inside the companies, and they can make sure they meet the IT requirements of companies and all that kind of stuff. So to me, that's sort of like we're in this third wave of how companies adopt tech, and it's sort of a hybrid of, or starting with like, what are the employees using and liking, but then sort of purposely, working with IT and decision makers to make sure it's sort of standardized or meets the bar for the company's sort of IT shared services standards.
I understand.
Yeah, I would echo that absolutely. Coming from our perspective, we because we're a communication tool, the adoption is 100% bottoms up. Actually, at this point, we don't even have a marketing team, and there's a benefit to that as well, which is that one, companies can test out these new tools with a team, which is the fundamental unit of collaboration. And the second benefit is when that team figures out a way to use it, all of the modern tools have a fair amount of customization that's possible. In Tandem, you can set up different rooms and different permissions. In Asana, I've actually led a transition to previous company to Asana. So as the head of product, I set up the workflows, right? And when you have a team that's leading the adoption, that the combination of the new tool and the culture that bridges that tool with your team can then make the company successful. So that there's a huge power to bottoms up adoption.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the shadow IT, Chris, and have you seen a difference in how organizations begin to engage with you and with collaboration software platforms like this in terms of before when you go bottom up, and because it's in the cloud, the threshold is really low. It's easy to get started, and it can starts with an individual or a team, and shared services or the group IT functions are not necessarily they don't mind. They are aware, they don't mind. Now, in the light of everything that is going on, it's critical, and shared services, group IT functions actually pay a lot of attention to things like security and policies and regulations and things like that. Do you see a change in behavior from your customers today?
Sure, and to get ahead a little bit, because I got a slide on this just to sort of frame it for everybody, but we're a more established company now. We're a 10-year-old company and post-Series Z and all that stuff, and sort of a mid-sized company. But we started exactly the way Rajiv did, right? Like everything was bottoms up, organic, self-serve, just providing value to teams in the beginning. Then we worked our way up. If you look at sort of adoption, I think a lot of your question is like, and also what's changed since the COVID era and this year and stuff. So that thing I described in terms of adoption, that's been the way of the world, and it's accelerating now. It's accelerating in the sense, like I'll use an analogy I think everyone gets, which is Zoom right now, right? Like Zoom is sort of obvious right now. But if you think about it, like industry sort of followed the Jeffrey Moore adoption curve, right? So like, early adopters and maybe some of the early majority, they sort of knew that video conferencing was finally ready for the whole company. Recently, but the rest of 2/3 of the world still didn't know. I mean, even after Zoom's IPO, still didn't know. After 20 years of trying with, all these different tools, video conferencing is finally ready for every employee. And that happened post-COVID. And so what's happening is CIOs are having to accelerate the tools that their employees need, the business problem that are enabled by the tools that their employees need most. I mean, you're seeing it in schools too, right? Where all of a sudden, it's not, we can have this phased deployment over time. It's like, I need it tomorrow, and I need to weed out what employees really need from the noise of all, of thousands of options. And I think that's where companies' heads are right now.
Interesting. Okay. So Chris, why don't you go ahead and share some of your thoughts.
Let's try this.
Content.
All right, let me see here. Can you see a presentation?
Yeah, we can.
All right, great. So I have a few more slides, but I wanted to go really quick, and I don't want to spend much time at all talking about Asana. I mostly want to focus on this business problem around, talk about the future of work in the context of collaboration and productivity, but zero in on the need for clarity that we're seeing today. And Andreas, while I'm presenting, I can't see you, so just let me know if I'm going off the rails or I cut out or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so just like in a slide quickly, Asana, don't want to spend a lot of time here. We've been around little over 10 years. Founders basically build a tool at Facebook to solve this problem they had at Facebook 10 years ago that's universal today, where in this case, all the tech and engineering teams found they were spending more time on work about work, trying to figure out who's doing what, if things are on track or off track, that kind of stuff, than actual coding. So they built an internal tool to solve that problem and give people more time, give the company more time back to their mission versus, talking about work. And that tool is so successful, the founders found Asana to sort of build a commercial version of that for the world. Product's been out there about 8 years. We now have north of 75,000 paying customers, actually millions of free customers across the world. And we're a leader in this category. The market's calling work management, which is sort of I see it sort of as, I'll talk about it, but it's about providing clarity and coordination for teams and whole companies. But from traditional categories, I see it as sort of the sort of democratization and rethinking of traditional categories like task management, project management, workflow management, goal management, portfolio management into something that's sort of integrated and works. So this is, maybe the next couple slides can help put a little teeth or data around what we've been talking about. This is data from last year from 10,000 knowledge workers, but McKinsey, lots of others put up data, and this is all true, and I'm sure resonates with everyone sort of before COVID, and then we could talk about the more recent impacts. And it's that when you look at what teams and companies spend their time on, they actually spend more time on work about work, coordination of work, trying to figure out who's doing what, when, is work falling through the cracks, are things going to be done on time, what's the status, than the actual work that rolls up to the goals and missions of the company. And the bigger the company, usually the larger percentage of status meetings and coordination stuff. So that's the overriding problem we're trying to solve, is to give companies more time for the light blue and the red towards their mission, and less time on work that doesn't, drive the mission of your company, essentially. And what we've seen, this is a main example everywhere, really, is that, while collaboration is growing exponentially over the last 10 years, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, in terms of all these great tools, like you mentioned earlier, Google Apps was my tool at Google, and I think it's, it in 365 and all these other great tools have really helped collaboration in so many ways. The flip side is that productivity is barely outpacing inflation over that time, while collaboration measured in the number of opportunities to connect and communicate in a given day is just growing exponentially. And the biggest gap between those things is lack of clarity of plan, of purpose, of responsibility and status. And so another way to look at that sort of resonates with everybody is the amount of pings you're getting. And people are just being inundated constantly with pings from every tool, and when you dig in, a lot of those pings, in a lot of cases, the majority of those pings are lack of clarity of who's doing what, when, and why, And so that's all been exacerbated by remote work. So I just brought a couple stats up from some more recent studies. On the right is something from before COVID, from the end of last year, that shows that at the time, more than 4/5 of global information workers felt overworked. The World Health Organization actually declared burnout a pandemic, an occupational phenomenon at the end of last year. And then since then, remote works in lots of ways. And there's advantages and disadvantages. There's pros and cons to remote work, right? But generally what we're seeing from the latest data is, 2/3 of knowledge workers are needing, they don't have a choice. They're turning to these communication and collaboration tools more. 1/5 of them are using these tools for the first time ever. 1 in 3 Americans are working, are starting work earlier, and another 1 in 4 are starting work later, and there's overlap between those two. So it's really hard, right? It's not just work from home. It's, work from home when the kids aren't homeschooling and you need to dial in and take care of them. Or if you're young, when your 5 roommates aren't in the living room and you can get on the internet. It's a really sort of complex picture. And then, so a little bit on breaking down the landscape we talked about, there's a real, what I'm finding is in talking to employees and talking to CIOs, decision makers, collaboration and productivity more and more these days breaks down mentally into 3 buckets. The tools around communications, where Tandem has a really great tool, and we just sort of talked about. This is where I would put, email and chat and video conferencing, tools that help employees connect and communicate. Tools around content, how you create digital, work together, documents, and the sharing of those files and documents. And what we found is what's the reason our category is sort of exploding is, what those tools don't really help you with is coordination, at the team level and at the organizational level of who's doing what, when, why. Most of that's done today in spreadsheets and meetings, sticky notes and email and chat and things that weren't meant for that. Traditional project management tools, like we all probably tried at one point in our careers with Gantt charts, weren't really meant for the team. They were meant for some PMO person, so they never really helped. And then vertical solutions for this stuff, there's tools that are purpose-built for specific processes. They don't work for the rest of the organization. So I would for you, but that's why this category is so on fire, and it's really more about the business need. And I thought I'd just spend a minute or two before I wrap up to show you what does that actually mean and look like, and share a customer example. So it's really, how do you bring structure to all this sort of unstructured conversations and stuff? And so the easiest way to think about it is, how do teams and companies orchestrate their work, from individual tasks to strategic initiatives to the processes and projects in between, so that everybody has real-time clarity, organizational clarity and coordination of who's doing what when. And so I thought the easiest way to do that is just show you a 90-second demo. And the way we think about this is, what we're trying to do, what this technology category is all about, is bringing, clarity to things that are unstructured or unclear. So starts at the tasks and action items that, individuals have, moves up to the processes and projects and workflows that you manage. For decision makers, that's more views across that on what's the status, what's on track and off track, and more often not now, how does that connect to our company's goals, so that there's transparency from the lower levels up to the goals and purpose of the company. And so just to show you what that looks like really quickly, at an individual level, it's, all your action items and priorities and tasks in one place, so you can prioritize your work, not be inundated by 1,000 emails trying to figure that out, and can actually spend a greater amount of time focused on, what matters most to you and your team and your company. From a project perspective and a process perspective, there's different views of that work that correspond to the way people work. So there's sort of a list or spreadsheet view for folks that work that way, you know, analytically, or in sort of a list. For folks that work in a, you know, that are more visual, that want to work in a Kanban or board type of view, same data, just a different view. You know, the data is all shared across this, so you can work that way. For folks that are more, you know, time and calendar focused, team leads and stuff, you can integrate this all directly. There's a calendar, you can integrate it directly into your Google or Microsoft Calendar. More traditional program management types like a program view, and you can think of this as a Gantt chart, sort of democratized, so there's value for everybody and it's simplified. Automation underneath all of this, so you can automate with templates and business rules any of these processes so they can be standardized and reused. The ability across these projects and teams to manage and optimize workload, to see where people and teams are overloaded and help spread the workload out. And lastly, you know, the ability to look across these projects and processes and understand what's on track, what's off track, and dig in where you need to. So thanks for bearing with me. I thought a quick demo would just, like, you know, help people visualize what we're talking about.
That makes sense. Thank you.
And then lastly, what it's used for. It tends to be used for projects and processes that don't have commercial tools, you know, and if you look at your average, say, mid-sized company, you know, there might be 150 business processes that matter, and, you know, 30 or 40 of those have a Salesforce or a Workday. The other 100, 120 don't. It tends to be those use cases that's driving adoption of these tools from a workflow perspective. And then lastly, you know, it's used by companies are adopting this in industries across the regions and industries these days. And I'll end with just some quick examples so people can make that tangible. Like Sony's using this in marketing for creative production. Sophos and Envision are examples of remote companies before all this that are using this to help, you know, with managed processes and transparency and coordination across organizations distributed and remote. Viessmann's a large German manufacturer using it for digital transformation. G2 Crowdlast is using this company-wide to connect the goals of the company to the execution of the work. So I will shut up there, but thank you for, you know, allowing me to give a quick overview to sort of frame stuff up.
Can you go back 3 slides, Chris, real quick? And you just want to...
Yeah, sure. One second here. Let me get back.
Sure. And while you do that, I'll just also reach out to all of you attendees that joined us. Feel free to post any questions that you would like us to relay to Chris and Rajiv, and we'll address that at the end of this event. Yeah, so Chris, I think, yeah, exactly. Thank you. So I think this slide is really interesting because obviously when we look at future of work and now work from home, every function is impacted of the company, every part of the organization. And obviously you have marketing here, product and engineering, IT, customer success. These are sometimes, unfortunately, functions in organizations that have gone siloed to an extent. And it's really an important aspect of succeeding is to get these functions to collaborating and working together when adopting these kinds of practices and tools. In your view and experience, what are the top 3, or what are the best practices to kind of address that kind of adoption challenge in an organization? Because I think if the chain is weak in one link, that's where the chain breaks. So where do we find like the best practices in actually adopting?
And adopting pretty much cross-functionally, right? I think that's your question. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it starts with clarity, right? Of like who's on the team, who's doing what, when, why. And if you think about how 95% of the world manages that today, it's like sad. And, it's visceral. Like literally it's, we need a meeting, spreadsheets, trying to figure it all out in emails. And it really starts with clarity of like, what's the goal? What's the steps between now and the goal? Who's the what, when, who's accountable? And, we can talk about technology as enabler, but if you forget technology, that tends to be the biggest challenge. And yeah, what happens in IT is there's really great solutions and all these, there's CRM solutions and people solutions and stuff that solve particular business processes. But a lot of times, right, you got to buy licenses just for those users. They're not necessarily meant cross-functionally. They're meant to automate certain business processes. So, you know, I could use an example of like, take product launch, right? Product launch, you know, launching a product or launching in a new market requires lots of functions across the company, right? It's critical. And, you know, if you don't start with the clarity of who's doing what when, it's kind of the Wild West and everyone trying to sort of figure that out organically. And what's happening now with COVID and work from home and all these things is, you know, you can't get everyone together in a room, and it's exposing the cracks of not having clarity up front. That's sort of my take.
Okay, I understand. So the next few steps ahead for you in terms of collaboration, platform, software functionality. There's so many different themes that intersect now. We have, you know, we touched already on social behavior, things like creativity. How do you creative work? How do you do creative work in this new context? New technical capabilities. One of the questions that have come in is, you know, relates to AR, XR, VR, you know, immersive experiences, that kind of technology, and kind of getting that into play here. And then obviously to your last slide, Chris, how these platforms actually support and enable business processes. So there's so many different themes that are going around that then next step or the iteration of this kind of category of platforms. What do you see ahead?
Sorry, can you be a little more like, what do I see ahead in terms of, sorry?
How these platforms evolve? I mean, is it supporting more creativity, social behavior aspects? Is it more supporting business process enabling, or where do you see this, you know, take off?
So I'll start with, if I my take, right? So if I think about horizontal collaboration and productivity in companies, I'm seeing the focus in the area first and foremost of like these centers of gravity. Like, can employees connect and communicate? Can they do that from wherever they're working? Can they do that remotely, synchronous and asynchronous? You know, from a content perspective, are they, you know, the work artifacts and the things that define the work, can they easily access, share, and co-create those things? You know, and then clarity. You know, does everyone know who's responsible for what, who's accountable for what? So I'd start there. In terms of maybe like some other aspects you mentioned of where that's going. You know, my take is like, there's a few different ways to slice it, right? The one that I usually hear the most is, what about machine learning and, you know, and all that stuff, right? And so that's an integral part of all of those platforms from my perspective. And like our ultimate goal is to be the GPS for work. So right now, you know, once the whole company uses it, bottoms up, everyone has clarity. Once we know that, we can actually predict next time you want to launch into a new market or new city, here's how to do it. Here's the steps based on what you've done before. But the reality of that is, you know, that's a couple years off. You know, I see machine learning and in all these tools, but I'll speak for Asana in our category, right now focused way more pragmatically on like recommendations based on what you're actually doing today. And you know, recommendations and things we can surface, or and for us, it's like things we can interpret as, hey, did you want this to be action? Do you want to make sure this happens? Do you want to make sure this is tracked? And, you know, that's sort of there's like in my mind, in sort of all these future work discussions, there's like a vision, which is great and important to have, but there's practical steps of what like users and companies and teams can actually be doing in the next year. And, you know, I'd sort of just described it for our category.
Yeah. Rajiv, any views there from you?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the progression, you know, the long-term view, kind of to give a similar perspective, the long-term view for us is we want to make it feel as dynamic and connected to work remotely as it is in person, maybe even more so. And I see a question in the Q&A about you know, AR and you know, VR, and I think that while that's very interesting, you know, on some time scale, the opportunity now is to massively level up how we work together where we do work. So for Tandem, it's really important for us that we exist right where you do work. because whenever I'm talking with somebody on my team, again, we're a platform for internal communication. And whenever I'm talking with somebody on my team, I usually have a document or a Kanban or something that I'm working on. So I think in terms of platforms, desktop and mobile are still going to be really fundamental for a very long time.
Another question that's come in: how might collaboration, work clarity, and team trust be quantified? Can we quantify it? Can we measure it? Can we progress? What's your perspective?
I could definitely offer perspective on that. So I think it's a little bit different for those categories. I actually think sort of productivity and the clarity piece is the easiest to quantify, because it's, how long did this take before? How long did this take after? Did it ship on time? Those kinds of things. How fast are the steps between now and then? We have lots of customers. Like, I'll give you an example. This actually gets into the sort of machine learning thing too. I recently had an airline customer, and before COVID, talking about their marketing team using Asana, and they talked about how a team of, I forget the numbers exactly, but I think it was a team of 20 needed, basically they freed up 3 people who spent their time trying to provide clarity of who's doing what when for the team, right? And a lot of people, because through automation, right? And the fear in the world with automation is that means like those people are gone. It was like, of course not. Those people can now be redeployed to more value-added activities, and it gives them, whatever that is, whatever 3 of 20 is as a percentage, 15% or whatever it is, more productivity. And so productivity, time is a great measurement, and it's the primary measurement we hear in our space, time and efficiency. I think it's a little looser, but still really interesting in the broader collaboration space. I know when I was at Google and and Microsoft, you see this at Dropbox and these companies, a lot of the focus is on engagement, right? Like, how engaged are different teams? Like, literally, you can measure with these tools how the rise in interaction in a given work stream. How much more and how much more often are people engaging to get work done together? And that's an interesting. It's a little fluffier metric, but it's really interesting. And the last thing I'll say that's really important is I think engagement's really interesting. And a lot of engagement has more been focused on that aspect. But where I find it going that hits close to home for us is millennials, right, want to work, and people want to work for companies with missions and purposes they believe in. But these days, they actually want to know, am I working on the things that matter? Am I having an impact? How does my work literally trace up and connect to the purpose and goals of the company? And literally until now, that really hasn't been possible, right? And so I see a lot of the new focus, and that's totally measurable from an engagement perspective, and it connects to the quantifiable impact.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in here. I love this question. I used to be a data scientist at Yahoo, so we've always been thinking about how to measure things in the real-time space. Now, in contrast with like the more asynchronous and document-based collaboration, it's quite difficult to measure the goals of real-time collaboration. And only recently, can we do this? Because most real-time collaboration took place in an office. It's not tracked, right? And so I think the short answer is it's difficult now, but we see a path to it. So one of the things that's quite well studied is just trust. And that's one of the fundamental goals for us, like building trust in remote and distributed teams. More formal definition, psychological safety, coming out of a lot of research at Google. Right. And there are ways of measuring it that are, benchmarks. And overall, what they found is that teams that move the fastest, teams that had the highest trust, move the fastest. And so that's one avenue, I think, towards measuring sort of that's measuring the result of better communications, both asynchronous and synchronous. Another aspect that is very interesting to us is there are actually some studies on communication patterns, specifically in high-performing development teams, like software development teams. And there's some randomized controlled studies on the optimal patterns. And they found that the optimal patterns for productivity weren't completely asynchronous, where everybody's just focusing independently, because people tended to move in different directions. And then they also weren't talking all the time. They were this in between, where there are periods of focus time interspersed with periods of heavy coordination, right? And I think they called it bursty communication. And so we're starting to enter a regime where it's more and more possible to build tools for organizations to keep a pulse on whether the communication patterns are healthy, are appropriately bursty, and in which departments, groups, units might need a nudge in a different direction. So I see a path to it, but it's still early to get a full picture.
Yeah, just to even add a little bit more onto that, like I like that thinking. It resonates with me and I think our customers, like this notion of like, I tried to talk about it earlier, but there's like lots of communication, right? And some of that is quality communication, you know, and some of that is draining, blood-sucking, wasteful communication, right? And what we're trying to do is, you know, and the general gist of this is to like reduce and eliminate the low to no value communication and increase the high value communication. And that's totally measurable. Like our customers, you know, I mean, you can think of it more tangibly and simply as like one of our largest customers is a big insurance company. They're saving an hour and a half a day per employee in status meetings that go away. Like that's something that's a tangible way to think about this. Yeah.
So an interesting other intersection, I've seen many discussions gravitate towards HR and HR supporting now in this change, and how important empathy is as we design new practices and policies and engage with employees who are now working from home and trying to cope, and then we need to support that. And then empathy also has this kind of tangent, you know, for many years now, empathy-driven design thinking practices in our industry. We've been talking about, you know, the relevance of having empathy towards the user. Do you see that accelerating or intensifying in your category? That actually, you know, really getting down to the feelings, the problems, to address it? Are you seeing any intensification there? And does it, you know, how does that fit into what you're doing, looking for?
Go ahead, Rajiv.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the user empathy, that's so fundamental to us. Like as I mentioned, you know, we are 100% bottoms up adoption, and we really succeed on the reason people use us is because of the interface, right? Because the user interface allows them to connect with their team in a way that they get a ton of value of. To what Chris was saying earlier, good communication, not bad communication. Signal, not noise. And so that is so fundamental. On an organizational level, going back to how to measure the impact of these things, there's actually, this is another well-studied area where how teams build trust and connection, or how people build trust and connection. There's a really great study called Being There versus Seeing There, where they measured with an iterative experiment trust between people with different communication media. And they measured in-person, video, voice only, and chat. And the interesting thing there was voice and video eventually reached the same level of trust as in-person, but chat by itself, chat is fundamental, but chat by itself never reached that level of trust. So that kind of just underlines the importance of that synchronous communication. Again, judiciously in bursts, yeah.
Interesting.
Andreas, did you mean empathy from the perspective of like technology providers like us, or do you mean empathy from perspective of, you know, companies that aren't in the Valley, the rest of the world, you know, and you know what I mean?
No, so I think primarily from a software platform company point of view, I think empathy-driven design thinking practices, and I just see this whole empathy topic theme just growing and intensifying in relevance, and especially also in HR. And that's also where another interesting conversation could go, obviously, is from a talent perspective. What are the new things we need to learn, and what are the things we need to develop and evolve? It could be like, you know, hard skills, but it could also be the soft skills. So that kind of thing.
Maybe one thought on that then, because I you know, this has been a big topic in the Valley for a long time, as we talked about. And what's actually most interesting for me is how it's making its way into transformation in our customers in the world, in the Fortune 500 and stuff like that, right? And you know, empathy, there's sort of the elements I think of the most are sort of like, you know, empathy in terms of understanding your customer, right? But also empathy in terms of how you get work done to deliver to your customer in terms of internal empathy. You know, how you and your partners bring products and services to market in a way where you're understanding where each other are coming from. And in both cases, a big driver is just transparency, right? Like if you can't, if you don't have visibility, to what others are working on or where they're coming from, you can't have empathy. And that's a lot of what's driving this work management thing as well. And I think what's interesting is that's sufficient.
Very interesting.
I'd love to add to that. I think my view is really, really simplistic. People are empathetic. If you increase transparency and you decrease the friction to communicating, people will develop empathy for their teammates and their company. And I think it's really that simple. And we've seen that again and again in companies. You don't need to do anything to encourage empathy. You just need to remove the blockers.
Right.
Yeah. And empathy is easy, if you're a Valley startup, right? Empathy is really hard in a 100-year-old Fortune 500 company where transparency is scary, and that's a lot of at the heart of like the opportunity and the challenges of transformation in more established companies.
Yeah. Wow, this is super interesting. We have time for one final question, and I'm just picking that from the chat here in the UI. So are there anything that surprised you or that's surprising you at the moment from a behaviors on collaboration or clarity seeking that are surprising, either from an organizational point of view or maybe if you take it from a user individual point of view, whatever level you want to look at it. What's in all of this that surprises you?
You want to go first, Rajiv?
I think I'd say it's the creativity of individual organizations. So one of the things I talked about was when you have bottoms-up adoption, you have a team generally leading the adoption of a tool, which also includes processes for the entire organization. And I think what we've seen is just an explosion of creativity and how teams set up those tools. So, for us, we have this concept of rooms where it's like a persistent call where you can sit to invite conversation. And we've seen in just a ton of people naming rooms in different ways, whether it's making their own personal offices or echoing rooms from their old office, or naming rooms creative things like help needed to signal that they need help from their immediate team. And I think with every productivity tool, we're seeing more and more creativity on a team and company basis, and more people who are sort of spearheading adoption, and they're sort of the champions of these new tools. And because of the new organizational structures, they're empowered to bring their company into this transformation.
I got maybe two answers, sort of randomly. One is like just in the experience we're all going through, and how quickly we adopted. And by the way, another thing is I'm blown away by schools and how, having to adopt tech and move to video conferencing overnight is, and the pace at which they've it's painful, but like just figured it out, is just blows me away completely.
Yeah.
I think some of the elements of like work from home, like you definitely hear elements that are better and you hear elements that are worse, right? And we didn't spend any time on it, but it's kind of obvious. But I'm surprised how much I like the aspect of just like seeing your kitchen. Like for everybody you interact with, you get these little personal things. And I don't know who hasn't been on a video conferencing where someone's kid came in and you can't stop them. Right. But it's cool. It's cool. It's just endearing and it like brings us together. I think that's good. I guess the last thing I would say is, and this might be a little self-serving, and it's like, why the hell are you surprised? But anyone I talk to about this, the reality that clarity is actually possible today at a level, because remember, this is a relatively new thing, and the market's on fire and we're all growing really fast, but 95% of the world's still doing this manually with spreadsheets and meetings. So, I talk to people and I'm shocked that I haven't met anyone that viscerally doesn't feel the problem. But I'm continually surprised by how many people still don't know a solution's possible today. Finally, like the video conferencing example I gave in the beginning. I'm shocked. I'm continually surprised every day that the rest of the world doesn't understand that you can have clarity for your team right now.
right now. Exactly. So we're on top of the hour. Chris, thank you so much for that final, I think, summary. I think the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed, as the famous thinker already said, right? So, and also to you, Rajiv, thank you for joining us and also sharing your perspectives on a few of many really important current themes around future of work. And to all of you attendees, I think all of us feel really connected to you, Chris and Rajiv, in this session. Felt we got to know you and you share your thoughts and perspectives on this really important theme. So thank you so much, Chris and Rajiv for joining us, and everyone for attending. I will want to also share with you the upcoming webinar already on June 2nd, already next week. We'll finish the series Future of Work together with Microsoft and Zaki, product manager for Teams, and Risto Lehtimäki from IDEAN. And I also welcome you to browse and read up on these themes, future of work, and the great digital divide from from our Capgemini Research Institute. So with that, thank you everyone. Thank you, Chris, again, Rajiv, and thank you for attending this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.